All right, everybody, we're going to talk about imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers. Now I'm going to be lazy here and use hashtag for numbers. Okay, so imaginary numbers. Now I want to go ahead and say they're called imaginary, but they're not imaginary in the same sense that we think of the word. They're part of what's called complex numbers, and we'll talk about that later. But I want to show you what an imaginary number is. So the first question I would ask is, what is the square root of 4? Well, we would say, and what does that mean? The question, when you take the square root of something, you're really asking what number times itself gives me 4? Well, in that case, it's 2. If I say, what's the square root of 1? What number times itself gives me 1? Well, 1 times 1 gives me 1. But what if I said, what is the square root of -1? Some of you may say -1, but what's -1 times -1? Well, negative times a negative is a positive. So -1 can't be square root of -1. If I said 1, well, 1 times 1 is still 1. So it can't be 1. And in fact, you can't take the square root of a negative number. So the question is okay, what is this? So is this just something we ignore, or what is it? Well, what we call the square root of -1 is I, and I represents the whole imaginary thing. But this is what we use to label square root of a negative number. So let's do some examples of where this may, help us out. So let's say if I ask you square root of -4. Now remember, when we simplify a radical, we factor it. But I'm going to separate this into two parts. So -4 is -1 times 4, right? And if you remember the rules of radicals, that's the same thing as the square root of -1 times the square root of 4. Now we just said that the square root of -1 we can write as I, and what's the square root of 4? 2. And we're multiplying these, and we can rewrite this as 2I. And so anytime you have a negative number underneath the square root, that's going to eventually come out and become a nice I. So one way to even think of, for instance, the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of -9 is 3I. Again, that I basically means that we still have that square root of -1 in here, and so we're going to have to attach that to it. And so we'll deal a little more with this later on, but I just wanted to give you kind of an introduction to imaginary numbers.